Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today and spending your Saturday with us. We are presenting on exploring American Indigenous history in the 20th century with Indian No More. I'm Katie Potter. I'm the Senior Literacy Manager at Lee and Low Books, and I'm joined by Elise McMullen-Ciotti, editor at Two Books. And we will first introduce ourselves, and then we are going to give a brief history behind Indian No More, which Elise will provide some details about and her experience editing the book. We're also going to talk about the impact of Indian No More because it's been quite a critical book to have come out. We'll talk about exploring Indigenous history in the 20th century, talking about how to use Indian No More in the classroom, and particularly with older grades as well. We'll conclude with teacher guides showing you where it is on our website, and then a question and answer to end the session. So as I mentioned, I'm Katie Potter. I'm the Senior Literacy Manager at Lee and Low Books. I develop our educator resources, which include our teachers' guides, our webinars, and professional development offerings. And I also work with nonprofit organizations and schools on how to incorporate diverse books into your respective programs.
Hi, OCO. I'm Elise. I'm an editor at Two Books, which is the middle grade and YA imprint of Lee and Low Books. I'm also a member of the Cherokee Nation out of Oklahoma. Hello, Oklahoma. I also, a lot of people don't know, but I also study about food. So I'm a food scholar, and especially food history and Indigenous food history. And so that's my little side gig.
Thanks, Elise. And we'd love for you all to introduce yourselves in the chat. So let us know what you teach or what kind of educational programs you're involved with, and where you're from. And that can also help us tailor, how we're speaking about today. Are you in the elementary grades, upper grades? Please let us know in the chat. And like we said, we're very thankful to you all today for joining us on your Saturday. Someone's from Oregon, Michigan, New York City, California. Wow, all over. Wow, this is amazing.
Yay.
Okay.
Wow.
Really cool. And it seems like we're covering all sorts of grades as well, which will be applicable for our talk.
Oh, nice. Salish.
Nice. Okay, well, Elise is going to start us off with talking about Indian No More, describing the book, the history. So Elise, take it away.
Sure. So Indian No More, I when I talk about how Indian No More as a book of what it does as a book and what the novel actually is, and then there's kind of the story of how the novel came to be and the process that we did with that. And so first, to tell you just a little bit about the book, this book is set in a time frame that we just didn't have a fiction book that dealt with this particular period of Indigenous history in the US, which is in the 1950s. We kind of just get forgotten after the 1800s. So the fact that Charlene Willing McManus, who wrote the book, it was kind of important to her to draw attention to this particular part of history because it was also her family's history. And that is what we call the termination era in Indigenous history. And so she told the story of a 10-year-old Umpqua girl that when her tribe is terminated, and they are basically, this is what happens, like, we're going to take your land back from you. If you want to buy it from us, great. But if you can't afford it, then you have to get off this land. This is kind of what happens there. And so Regina and her family take part in the Indian Relocation Act, and they move to Los Angeles, where they're expected to assimilate. And Regina has to decide who she is now that she is no longer on her native land, that she is separated from her community, and she's in California in the 50s, coming up against a lot of other culture and expectations of what it means to be Indian there, because you have the Hollywood Indian going on. And so she's like, why don't we have teepees? Why don't we have this? And so the book is really about becoming firmly implanted in your identity when you are separate from your community. And this was just a very important book. As far as how the book came to be, Charlene brought in stories from her family to create this book. This is pictures of her house in Los Angeles, and her neighbors. But unfortunately, Charlene passed away while we were in this process of making this book. And she asked a good friend of hers, Tracy Sorrell, to finish this process and finish up the book for her. And Tracy is part of the Cherokee Nation along with me. I was asked to be the editor on the book. And here we are, two Indigenous women from a different nation trying to bring out a book for that was basically in a completely different community at Grand Ronde, in the Umpqua community there at Grand Ronde. And it was just not our story and not our place. So we collaborated with the Grand Ronde community and the culture keepers there as we wrote this book, because we needed to honor that. Not all Indigenous people are the same. And it's very, very important that we made sure that their voice was heard, and that the book was going to benefit them and not just be us taking the story and running with it. Charlene made a very wise choice with Tracy Sorrell, who's an amazing author, who went to Grand Ronde, met everyone, did the research that she needed to do. This is something that we didn't say in the book, but it's a Cherokee principle called Gadugi, which means kind of we all band together to get something done for the community, that we're all taking care of one another. And that is kind of the spirit of how we approach this book, and making sure that it honored everybody appropriately, down to the very specific pronunciations of certain Umpqua words. It was very, very specific. We also made sure to have an Indigenous artist do the cover of the book to incorporate a lot of Umpqua symbolism in the cover. That was also very important. Oh, well, the history. I first encourage all teachers to take a moment to really look at Indigenous history from World War II all the way up through present day. There is so much that happens in Indigenous history that gets left out of our curriculums, that's happening right along at the same time of so many other things that we teach about. So I just encourage you to look into what was going on as you go along in history. This particular book takes place during the termination era, which began in the kind of late 40s, but 1950s. There was a 1953, that's the best year to say. It was kind of began in 1953. And basically what was happening is that it implemented they implemented a tribe by tribe basis, where they actually severed the relationship between a Native nation and the U.S. government, because it is like a nation to nation relationship. And so they were severing that and taking that land and forcing people off. And so that is the era that this is happening in this book. And so you actually get to see them leaving their reservation and going into a city. So this book really does cover what that experience is like, especially for this West Coast Indigenous nations. The relocation program was financial government support to get people situated in these urban centers, in hopes that it would kind of erase the Indian within us and make us like everybody else. While that was going on, we also have the civil rights movement happening. At this time, Regina and her family would have been reading about the Little Rock Nine in the paper. So there was a mass deportation of Mexicans back into Mexico during this time. So there was a lot going on while this was going on. um, something to keep in mind, though, is that when there was this termination, for Indigenous peoples, it felt like a death. And that is something that it wasn't just you have to move. It felt like a death. Your identity was being stripped from you. And of course, this happens over and over and over in Indigenous history. But this is something to remember of how this felt to many Indigenous people. It was the equivalent of dying, basically. But I want to also just bring in the fact that after this occurs, after this story, if you're using this in the classroom, to not stop at this history that this book covers, because there was afterwards the restoration and self-determination eras that was going on. And so I definitely encourage you to look at Indigenous history post 1968, because it was 1968 was the time when we Lyndon Johnson said, oh, we need to have a better relationship with Indigenous people. They called us the forgotten Americans. And then Nixon came in right after that and condemned termination. So there were these like historical markers that were happening in the US government. But at the same time, Indigenous people were truly coming back from this, claiming our history, claiming our languages, and consolidating together to reclaim what we had lost. And so I encourage you all to also check out post 1968, when the termination era was ending. Beyond this, let it be a springboard to the next part. That's next part of Indigenous history. I think that covers a good amount. I could do a whole session, just a whole session on Indigenous history, which we don't have time for today. Let's see. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much, Elise. That was an incredible overview of the history behind Indian No More. And I think we would love to hear from you all about where you would use this in your curriculum. How do you see yourselves integrating this into the units that you're teaching now? How can you teach about this critical history that is rarely taught in traditional social studies curriculum? Answer in the chat. And that way you can also all, brainstorm together and take your ideas and springboard off of each other. So I see some questions.
We'll definitely get to recommendations later.
Yeah, and in the question and answer, that's a great one. Oh, I love that idea. Elise, you'll love this too. California fourth grade history as a counter narrative to the LA Hollywood era.
Yes, that's great. That's a great example.
Mm-hmm. Let's see.
Oh, yes, it's a perfect, the book is really, it's not too long. So it really is great for, getting a classroom, reading it together and going over it together, like from fourth grade up, I would say, and really kind of looking at this history.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, I like this about the prosperity that didn't reach all Americans. Yes, that's great.
Mm-hmm. California, yes, we get asked back to people who are answering about their California fourth grade curriculum. We get asked many times for California mission books about California missions, but this would be great to pair alongside that, especially how Elise, when she mentioned, of course, not all Native and Indigenous peoples are the same. Showing the diversity within and among Native and Native tribal nations is critical.
And I think there was Lin who was saying that, yes, this type of, stealing the land or taking land, how it continued way after the 1800s. My nation in particular right now, along with all the other 39 nations that's in Oklahoma, is still under risk. Our sovereignty is still under risk. The governor there is just kind of bound and determined to erase that from us. So it's not something that isn't present in Indigenous life today. Our sovereignty means a lot to us, and we are still having to kind of fight the good fight in this, and making sure that we are able to maintain that to this day.
Mm. Um, Sarah said, as a tribal citizen born during the termination era, I think it's important to invite guest speakers who can share their story of growing up during termination and restoration of contemporary Native issues.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So welcome, welcome.
Wow, you all have such amazing ideas.
Yeah.
Keep it going because, this is here, we're here to share everything with each other. And um,
Oh, I love Jenny about bringing the mission era to modern terms. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
this is a great compliment to Birch Bark House. I know Birch Bark House is popular and sometimes it's the only Native title on your shelf. And Indian No More is really a wonderful contemporary counterpart to that book.
Oh, City of Ghosts. Sorry, I'm just commenting on the comments.
I know these are all amazing. So the impact of Indian No More, of course, this as Elise has explained so eloquently the history behind this book, it's really the first middle grade novel and novel for children to center the termination era in 1953 to 1968. Actually, more recently, Louise Erdrich wrote The Night Watchman, and it also touches on the termination era. It's an adult novel. If you're in a high school course, it would be wonderful to pair the two of those together. But really, it was the first middle grade novel to focus on the termination era. And that is an incredible feat in and of itself. It won the 2020 American Indian Youth Literature Award. I think it's particularly special because, as Elise had said, such a wonderful group of Native women worked on this book and brought it to life, especially after Charlene's passing. And when Elise and I were having conversations about Indian No More, Elise said something that really rang true with me. She said, this is a true book. So it captures true modern Indigenous history. It brings it to life. And it really elucidates the fact that not all Indigenous people are the same. We as a group in this session know that, but a lot of people don't. And a lot of students haven't been taught this history. So we need to bring this book to them and open their eyes to this modern and Native and Indigenous history that is still happening to this day. It really acknowledges other Indigenous peoples' communities. And like I said, it was a collective effort to bring this book to life. It celebrates within the book, and also the power of this book is that it celebrates the diversity and solidarity within and among Native and Indigenous nations, and also other BIPOC people. It was happening during the civil rights era. Regina meets her Black neighbors and becomes friends with them, but they're all learning from each other. Stereotyping plays a huge role in this book, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But it's really a chance to unpack how people are perceiving each other, how we perceive ourselves, how we can work together to foster identity, solidarity, and community. So Elise mentioned this earlier, but when termination era ended in 1968, it didn't really end. I mean, 1968 is a date that we have on paper, and in the, legally, but it still took another 20 years. And like I said, still to this day, for Native and Indigenous people to start rebuilding and restoring their communities. Like Elise said, it was a death. I mean, the fact that these families were split apart, they were so wrongfully removed from their lands, from their homes, and just really, I think it's critical to acknowledge that it's still happening to this day with students, and it was really this book really approaches the dismantleization of culture and history. And those processes are incredibly difficult to undo. Thousands of, hundreds and thousands, to undo. Elise had mentioned on 1983, after nearly 30 years of after termination, President Reagan signed House Resolution 3885, which is also known as the Public Law 98-365. And this law restored the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde community as a federally recognized tribe. And just talking about this history with students, that Native and Indigenous history is humanity's history. It's all of our histories. Um, you know, how can we insert this critical history into our curriculum? So for every social studies topic in the classroom, Elise and I were talking about, what would it be like to examine the Native and Indigenous history simultaneously? So for every social studies unit that you're obligated to teach in your classroom, what's going on in those Native communities? We spoke about the example of Veterans Day. I know many of you are familiar with Native and Indigenous veterans, and many have so many incredible accomplishments that have gone unacknowledged. We have at Leomo Books, we have a biography called Quiet Hero, the Ira Hayes story about Ira Hayes, a Native veteran who rose the flag at Iwo Jima. And that you can do on Veterans Day. It doesn't have to be, you don't have to create something from scratch. It can be fused in seamlessly. Yep. Brian said we take every anchor event in history and we look at multiple perspectives of that event. Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly what we can do with Indian No More and what this book presents, just because we know that we teach civil rights. That's a given. So incorporating the history behind Indian No More. I just mentioned Quiet Hero, mm-hmm. The Ira Hayes story. It's a biography for you to teach during Veterans Day, and of course, all year. But really, if you want to start incorporating modern and contemporary Native and Indigenous content, using those days as examples. Elise is going to take us through some more details about using Indian No More in a modern context.
It's this question, like even thinking about this slide and thinking about how do we do this? How do we put this in a modern context? It's kind of an odd thing to think, because especially as an Indigenous person, I'm like, well, we're here, we are modern, we are contributing. There's like Katie mentioned Veterans Day. And I think that's something to really think about, that per capita, that there are more Native Americans that are joining military service than any other group of people in the US. And so we are defending this land. There are Indigenous people defending this land for the nation. We also have such ingenuity and knowledge that we take from this land that goes way beyond recorded history. I was telling Katie recently about how I was at a Cornell teaching where they were talking about different kinds of fishing, and the one that was the most sustainable was actually the way Indigenous people have been doing it on the coastlines for centuries. Which was like a new novel idea for Cornell at this moment. So there's so much that's going on presently in Indigenous culture and in what we have brought to the table that it's a shame to be missed. It's like not putting salt on your food. There's just something that's missing when you're leaving out this particular history. So when I think about how to incorporate this, Indian No More when you're teaching about modern history, I think one of the things that lands probably the closest when you're thinking about how do I put this in with the community, other communities that are there, is actually a discussion of community. Community for us is extremely important. I know that when I moved to New York City, I was missing my Indigenous community a lot until I made other Indigenous friends. It was like difficult for me having being able to give back to your community, support one another, community is just super important. I know that I don't do everything just for myself. I'm thinking of my family. I'm thinking of my community. This is something that is important. And I know that for kids that are coming from a lot of different cultural perspectives also have a sense of community. And this is where you can share with one another. This is what we do in our community. What do you do in your community? How do we support our community? How can we use certain Indigenous ideas around community to talk about this, especially how to protect our elders? How do we support our elders? How do we take care of the elderly? These are some really nice thematic topics that you can take into your classroom. And I think it's important to remember that Native people are also a part of the community that you're in. You might not recognize it right away. I'm sure the teachers here, my goodness, y'all are just really thinking about it. Thank you. But there might be an Indigenous person in the classroom and you might not even know. So it's kind of nice to think about that. Also think about the language that's going on. We have a lot of language restoration that's happening across Turtle Island, where we are trying to reclaim our language. I would encourage people to find out what were the languages spoken in the communities in your area, what's going on with that. How can maybe students learn a little bit about the Indigenous languages of their area and what people are trying to do there. It's a lot of languages, I tell you, a lot, a lot of languages. Also, I think it's interesting maybe to bring into a classroom this idea of ancestral knowledge. When we talk about passing down story to story, any child can go and like say, hey, grandpa, tell me about, when you were a child. That is actually receiving ancestral knowledge from a grandfather. What was it like in his history? I used to do this with my grandmother. Not only would I ask her about Indigenous, like Cherokee stories of our family, but I also wanted to know, what was it really like for you in World War II? What was it really, what did you experience? Asking my mother, what was going on in, in the 60s with Indigenous people. They are culture keepers in a way, and they passed on knowledge. This book really celebrates that passage of ancestral knowledge. And we honored that in the book by putting a water symbol along the edge of a page wherever ancestral knowledge was being passed and story was being told. And so I think we have in the teacher's guide a little activity where kids can go and ask a story from an elder and be able to write it down and create an activity about that. That is something that's very deeply a part of Indigenous culture, and something to think about thematically as you're going about your work. Also, circles. I know this is strange, but to talk about circles, but I don't know if you've ever noticed you're going into some kind of Indigenous space and you start to see circles. Circles mean a lot to us a lot of times. When we have meetings, we sit in circles a lot of times. Not for every single nation, but I just thinking of how we, and I always pause when I say we, because I'm talking about many different nations, not just my own. So I can't speak for everybody. I can only speak for myself and my own nation properly. But thinking of the idea of a circle, when you are in a circle, everyone is facing one another. You see everybody in that circle. Everyone is acknowledged in that circle. And that circle can widen the more that you bring people into a circle. We talk a lot about how we use the table as an example of this. How many additional tables can you add so that you can bring more people to a table? The circle is also in this way of being able to honor your full community. And I think about how we have our inner circle of our family, our circle of our neighborhood, the circle of our town, the circle of our region, our state, our country. We have these circles, and how they all represent this community, this humanity that we have with one another. And I think taking kind of an Indigenous frame about how we see one another, about facing one another, opening that circle, is a way to promote empathy, to be able to acknowledge other people, to acknowledge other cultures, and definitely here in this moment, in this conversation acknowledging Indigenous culture, but being able to kind of look at it from an Indigenous perspective about what that means. We also, another idea that I like to talk about, it's something I've been saying for a while, called sow and grow. In Indigenous communities, we know a lot about how to care for, and even knowledge that we're trying to make sure that we keep and pass on and nurture, is how to take care of the environment that is around us, the earth that's underneath our feet, the trees around us, the animals around us. These are also our community. They are a part of that circle. We are a part of that nature circle. And so being able to bring up ideas in the classroom about how to take care of space around us is also great. If you're reading in the book, you'll find that Regina's grandmother is teaching her how to sew. She knows how to sew. She's teaching her granddaughter how to sew. They make this wonderful coat. The grandmother makes these curtains, and she's passing that knowledge down to Regina. And that is very important in this passing. And even in my lineage, having my great grandmother teaching my grandmother, teaching my mother, teaching me how to take care of ourselves, how to sustain ourselves, how to sustain our communities, is something very important. Even our language, which even in the Cherokee language, a lot of the words represent their use. So when we lose the language, we use the usage. So being able to pass the language on, pass the stories on. So if you've got Grandparents' Day, pull out India No More and talk about what that ancestral knowledge is being passed, and not just in Indigenous folks in the class, but everyone, and being able to create these themes. So I highly encourage you to think of all these other ways that you can incorporate things in a classroom outside of history, but in more like thematic community things with family, things with in relationships and with empathy. It really is a nice launching pad to go into so many spaces with that. And I could go on forever about it.
I mentioned the Umpqua water symbol is on the screenshot. This is a screenshot of one of the pages in Indian No More. And I think it would be a really useful activity for students, for students to know that that is what that symbolizes, and for students to go through the book and identify where that happens, and thinking about and synthesizing what knowledge is being passed on that page, and why that Umpqua water symbol was being used on that particular page.
Yeah.
And so using Indian No More with older grades, what everything Elise said can obviously be used in older grades. But why we included this slide is because this is a middle grade novel. Traditionally, it's used 4th through 8th grade, but this can absolutely be used with high school for those of you who are working with older students, grades 9 through 12, even in college settings, absolutely. We've touched on a lot of these points, but examining this history that's not traditionally taught with a new lens. I think pairing this book, and in our next slide, we're going to have you all brainstorm about what books you can pair alongside this Indian No More, but using, if you're obligated to teach something that's in, I want to use quotes around this word, in the canon, or something, or a book that's mandated, that's part of your curriculum, how can you use Indian No More to complement what's being taught in that book? Identity is a huge component. Elise had mentioned this already, but really talking about how we feel about ourselves, how we see ourselves. Regina is going through enormous identity changes and introspective throughout the book. How she does that, how she manages and recognizes those emotions when that's happening, how people perceive her, how she perceives other people, what word, and what we can learn from one another. Another way, we've talked about this already, but really aligning your the Native and Indigenous historical timeline in Indian No More with the units that you're doing in your classroom. So with that said, and um, even just without having read the book, if some of you have not read the book, what titles could you pair Indian No More with? I mean, I know some people mentioned Birch Bark House. I couldn't see the other. Um, I can't quite remember the other titles, but throw it in the chat to give our other participants ideas as well. Oh yes. Um,
Oh yes, Tracy's book, We're Still Here. An Encounter is also great. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah.
Oh,
Also feel free to throw in books that that you have to teach um, in your curriculum. I think that's helpful. A lot of teachers that I have worked with, at least in when we've done professional development, they have to teach particular titles that they don't necessarily agree with, or that their values aren't aligned with that particular text. So feel free to tell us if you have to teach any books that you don't necessarily like or agree with, and how you can use Indian No More with it.
I was something we didn't mention was that the father in the story is a veteran, and so that also is a big part of this book. So bringing in some veteran ideas with this as well. I saw that there was a code talkers mentioned there. Absolutely, that's definitely similar in time and themes. They're there. My goodness.
Amazing. Yeah.
Up on the middle at the mountain's base. There's Tracy again. um,
Oh,
yeah, Seed Keeper. Oh, Seed Keeper. All Tracy's books. That's right.
Island of the Blue Dolphins is definitely that is one that that you may not necessarily agree with, but this would absolutely be a
Wonderful replacement.
wonderful. Yes.
uh, yeah, Braiding Sweetgrass. Oh, that has that's a nonfiction novel by a wonderful native botanist. I think teachers should all read this book, and they can come up with ideas that they can incorporate things into their classrooms at many ages. Love it. Esperanza Rising also is a great for grandparents, like being able to put in this kind of lineage, ancestral ideas. Wonderful. Oh yes, I heard about the braiding sweetgrass coming with the youth one. Yes. Wear water protectors, also great.
So to conclude, because I want to make sure we have time for some question and answer. We've talked about this a lot already,
Yeah,
Elise.
I think I just put all what I was going to say together, Katie. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, so we can, if it's okay, we can move on to the next slide. We talked about this already, so
Yeah,
we
we
covered
can
it. Yeah.
forward.
So, and we touched on this too a little bit, but any more ideas that people want to provide about inserting this modern and Indigenous history into your current curriculum, wherever you see fit? On the last slide, we were talking about STEM and science applications. What Elise had talked about ecological, having an ecological perspective. Elise, did you want to talk a little bit more about the site? Did you touch on that?
Well, as relating to India No More, I think it's not like in India No More, there's like a direct story initiative about nature, like how to tend nature within this particular story. However, the fact that she is missing her reservation and what was there, I think is also about how we connect to the land, there's like references of like, there's this little patch of grass now that they have in their yard and the different things going on. How do you disconnect how do you reconnect when you're in an urban setting? I know living in New York City, the way I try to take care of myself when I need to reconnect to nature and there's nowhere I can go, is I look at the sky. That's still something for me to look up at and say, I'm still a part of this. This is still my community. I can function here. So, but yes, there's still, just in a general sense, there's a lot that you could pull in different Indigenous ideas into understanding that we are part of nature, not separate from it. I think this is something very important. But the teacher's guide, yes, go teachers.
Yeah, so the teacher's guide, Elise did the teacher's guide for us very graciously, and I worked with her on it as well. Please refer to the teacher's guide for more information. All of the background history that we talked about today is touched on in the background section of the teacher's guide. So it's quite lengthy. We have literal comprehension questions, extension, higher level thinking, social and emotional learning. And so instead of going through it page by page, I just wanted to give two examples of activities that you could do. Elise mentioned that Regina learns to sew from her grandmother, and Regina and her grandmother have a very close relationship. So having students interview a family member, a family friend, someone, an elder in their community about a particular skill. That could be cooking, gardening, woodworking, whatever's relevant in their lives. And interviewing about that skill. How did they acquire that skill? Who did they learn it from? Really engaging students with communicating with their elders and tying that back into how elders are critical in Native communities. Social and emotional learning, I talked about this earlier, but learning about identifying and learning about the stereotypes that are evident in the book. Microaggressions, having students examine those. What do they look like? How can we approach them in our own lives as well?
I also want to mention that this is a free download off our Lillian Lowe website. So, I mean, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there's so much more background information, lists of resources. We pull a lot of information from the back matter of Indian No More, in all, not just Indian More in No More, but with all of our teachers' guides. We have extensive back matter, bibliographies, and additional resources to learn from. So we have a Native American and Indigenous book list for grades pre-K to E and above. We have quite a variety of Native and Indigenous titles at Lee and Low. So please, I encourage you to check it out. You can also email me if you're looking to expand your libraries or want to learn more about the Native and Indigenous titles and First Nations titles that we have to offer. I'd be happy to work with you and your school. Okay, so we have about 7 minutes for, I'm going to give everybody my email. So please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you, not just if you about how you like the presentation, anything, please reach out. Question and answer. Please. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Lily.
I saw somebody say something I'm mentioning earlier about how important it is to understand the names of people, and someone else mentioned fry bread. I worked on fry bread on the in papers of that lists all of the Native nations within the boundary of the United States, the continental boundary. And what we did is we called everybody, what is your real name? Like the BIA might not have it. It's listed by so many different things. What do they want to be called? So someone asked a little bit about that. Yes, always find out what is your nation, what and how, how do you pronounce that? How do you like to say that? What is that? Make it individual. It's very good.
So there was a question earlier, and everybody feel free to start typing in your questions. There was a question earlier. I
Oh,
am.
Gadoogie. Gadoogie is a Cherokee word that's really it's the spirit of Gadoogie, means us all coming together, support one another, taking care of one another. It's all kind of joining in, but it's a little deeper than that. The theme of that is we look beyond ourselves and we look at our community, and we all come in.
Okay.
So glad.
Do you have any recommendations for books that we can look at that cover Indigenous history?
Well, there was Debbie Reese's book, which is actually a historical book, The Indigenous People's History of the United States. I think, if I'm getting the title right, she has a young adult version of that. You might look into. It's pretty good, pretty good. Also, there are kind of looking into, I know it's more kind of like when you're looking at movements, like was the Black Panther movement and this movement, that movement. There was the American Indian movement that you might want to kind of look at their community things that they did in creating schools and curriculums to try to bring back Indigenous culture. There's some good books about that.
Someone asked about boarding schools. We have at Lee and Low Books, we have Home to Medicine Mountain. I'm going to type it in the chat. And that is about two boys. It's a fictional story, but of course the author based it off of experiences from their family about two boys and their experiences in the boarding school, about how they were stripped of their languages and they were able to escape. I hope I'm getting this all right.
I think I was seeing a question about appropriation, things like that, and kind of a monolith idea. If I'm understanding the question right, I think that when you're talking about Indigenous themes and Indigenous topics, I think it's always good to bring something down to the specific. What did the Pueblo say about this? What did the Cherokee say about this? The Navajo, the Salish, bringing in these different nations. So, because we are all one in solidarity, but we are not all one in culture. We're divided in kind of these regional cultural pockets. So I think being able to bring in specificity in a classroom and honoring that nation and honoring that specificity starts to erase some of this kind of appropriation and pan-Indian thing that we tend to get.
Mm-hmm.
Good question.
Just sorry to interrupt, just two more minutes.
Two more minutes. If I can take 30 seconds of that 2 minutes, one of the things that, if you look on the tagline of the back of the book, I have the book with me today. If you look on the tag on the back of the book, it says, "Who gets to say who we really are?" And I think that's such a great way to approach when we're talking about communities of any kind of identity, any kind of history, any kind of culture, to be able to say who are we taking the power from? How can we take the power back? How can we honor people around us? Who gets to say who we really are? We do. So Indigenous people get to say who we really are. People get to say who we really are. And I think honoring that is important, because especially in Indigenous communities where we've been moved around a lot, taken from lands, brought back here, there, no, you can be here, no, you can't be here, blah, blah, blah. That erasure is so deep that being able to acknowledge each nation and who they are, and each person and who they are, and getting to know them personally is so important. So I hope that is a good way to round up a bit.
I think so. So please follow us on social media. Also, our blog has some really great teaching applications and ideas to use Native and Indigenous books in the classroom. And please contact me. kpotter@leonlow.com. I'd love to hear from you. Please let me know. And, please let me know what you think. If you need additional resources, book ideas, I'm happy to help. All right,
Thank you so much,
everybody.
everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much.